Welcome back to this episode of The Self-Led Leader. Today, I've had the pleasure of speaking with Michael Merrill, former executive at Netflix and Disney. And today, we got to unpack everything around leadership and career progress. So whether you're new to leadership or whether you're on your way to a senior role, today we covered the do's and don'ts of leadership and of your career progression so that you can actually start doing the things that move the needle and get recognized for the things that you want to get recognized for while avoiding the things that are harming you along the way. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Welcome to The Self-Led Leader, a podcast for high performers who want to lead from alignment, not expectation. I'm Dr. Christina, a social psychologist, and I'm here to help you lead with clarity, not chaos. This show is about what happens before the strategy, your mindset, your nervous system, the inner leadership that shapes everything you say and do. Because presence isn't about being loud, it's about being aligned. Let's get right into it. Welcome to this episode of The Self-Led Leader. I am so excited to have Michael Merrill with us. He's the former executive at Disney and Netflix. He's led teams over 100 and knows quite a few things about leadership that I'm so excited to get into. And now he helps professionals advance their careers. And who doesn't want that? So thank you for being here, Michael.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited and crazy to think that we just connected over LinkedIn. This is that message to everybody that if you are afraid to network, just put yourself out there a little bit because it's been awesome to get to know you.
Yeah, thank you. You as well. Can you start maybe just by sharing a little bit about your experience and what it was like to become an executive at such revered companies?
Yeah, sure. So long ago, I'd gone to film school with the idea here of I wanted to make movies. And during that time period, I actually ended up working at an awesome place in order to put myself through school. That was Macy's, selling women's shoes. But I jokingly refer to that as my Cinderella story because I did end up selling a shoe to somebody who worked at Disney at the time. And through that, I actually ended up getting in a temporary position there because I asked him, like, well, what do you do? And it was in the beginning of a DVD as VHS was going away. And ultimately at that point, they needed a lot of help. So I ended up jumping over into that role over there. And when I did so, it was really interesting because I thought my whole career was going to be around the movie making side of it. I was still in that realm as I joined Disney, but I actually spent the first couple of years of my career waiting and hoping for that advancement. And it actually didn't end up happening at Disney. And so in the end, I had a friend who mentioned, hey, DreamWorks is hiring. And I'm like, all right, well, let me check that out. I got the job over at DreamWorks. Lateral move, no additional pay, but at least it felt like career movement because I wasn't going anywhere in my, career, or if you will, or my job at Disney. Then what ended up happening over there is I ended up in this really crazy culture that when I say crazy, I'm talking like this is where the head of the department, she actually enjoyed that her assistant would throw flower pots at the wall and they would break. Like it wasn't healthy. Like she liked to egg that stuff on. And all of a sudden I got this taste of, wow, this is what culture. DreamWorks was a good company, but this little area was not the best. But at the same time, throughout the way, I'm getting these really interesting looks at how leadership could look across the different areas. And about a year into that, I decided, you know what? Maybe this isn't the right thing. The department went through 12 people and it was only a department of 12 over the course of a year. Like people just weren't sticking around. Now, some of those roles turned twice. It was that sort of a department. But after that, I decided, you know what? My friend who I actually had gotten at Disney, he had said, there's a position back over here. You want to come back over here? So I reapplied back at Disney, tail between my legs, ended up landing that job. But when I did this time, it was with a really important lesson I had during my exit interview, which was ultimately when I had the exit interview, I said to the head of the department at the time, I'm like, I was bummed. I was hoping for a full-time position here and it just didn't work out. So I'm leaving. And his response back to me was, oh, I didn't know that's what you wanted. I wish I would have known. Which at the time to me, I'm just like, well, I mean, why do people work jobs was my mentality. I'm like, of course I wanted something like that. And that lesson stuck with me. Funny enough, not necessarily when I went to DreamWorks, but by the time I came back and thought about it at Disney, because I realized you can't make assumptions that people know what you want. And I think that goes for life in general. But for me in my career, that was like the beginning where I'm like, huh, okay, I got you. I need to make these things a lot more clear. And that changed things drastically for me. And eventually I would actually end up reporting into that, head of the department, actually leapfrogging over people who were my own managers. My own manager eventually reported into me. And the reason was baked into that basis of a lesson. Obviously, there's more to it, which I'm sure we'll get into. But from there, I became an executive. I was getting promoted every 1.5 to 2 years at Disney. And I became an executive when I was still in my late 20s. And then eventually, parlay that into moving up in a career at Disney, leading over 100 people. And then eventually that leapfrogged me over to Netflix, where I then led global teams over there around the world, which is a whole different type of leadership that you have to consider. But ultimately for me, that in a nutshell is kind of it. Started off in this career that was stuck and then started to figure out what it takes. And I became a student of it. And I look at myself that way across so many things that I dive into. I love learning. And with that, I started thinking, there's probably this process to how people advance their careers. And through that, I created a system, which is what I help people with today in their careers, to help basically get to where you want to go faster, because life runs on systems, our bodies run on systems, our cars are systems. So it's like there's also a system at career. They just don't teach it in the universities, or it's not something usually parents will teach you. Usually the answer everybody tells you is work hard, keep your head down, don't rock the boat, is like the career advice you get, which is, I'll say, horrible, except there might be a few people who need a few of those things to keep in mind. So anyway, that was the long story how I got there.
Yeah, I love it. That's really cool because I think hearing that for me, it's like it must have been so satisfying to go from being under someone to then having them report to you, especially if they weren't a great leader. I'd love to hear more from your experience. What, like, the changes that came with being a leader at different levels and like how that evolved the higher up that you went.
I think one of the most important things that people will overlook, because we first look at, when you go into career, a lot of people are thinking in terms of, I don't want to say being led, but in many ways they are looking for a boss or somebody to be like, tell me what to do. And that's a shift that has to be made quickly. You don't want to just be somebody who's doing the things, that you're told to do. But I think to get there, because that alone, being able to start thinking in those terms is important. But the first thing you have to do to be able to do that is something that I know you talk about a lot, which is the idea of this, leading yourself first. And the idea with that one, and I usually tie it back to emotional intelligence. And early on, I think that book called Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goleman really influenced me, because it started making me think about things differently. Because emotional intelligence boils down to a couple of different things, self-awareness, self-regulation, social awareness, and the relationship management of those around you. And once I started connecting those things, especially that self-awareness, I consider myself a pretty reflective person, but I started really thinking about these things in terms of the people around me instead of just let me know what I should do. It started becoming, okay, what do these individuals need? How can I help them with those things? Some people, you're going to only be able to go so far in your career if you don't move into leadership. And I hate saying that, because there are some people who just don't want to do that and maybe aren't built for that. But it's just a reality that the larger responsibilities that you have, the more they could justify paying you. And usually that comes with leading large teams, because then they're the ones doing the work and it multiplies what you're able to do. So I would say, that focusing, really understanding like emotional intelligence was a really clear unlock for me. And then I think what I alluded to before too, around just the idea of like clarity, like as soon as I decided not to keep close to me what it is I was trying to achieve, that then became this other big unlock. Because so many people, we might be hesitant to say that head of the department at the time, one of the things that he had said to me was, he said, I know that you came out of film school and I assumed you were still pursuing a lot of those things that related to, making movies. That's what he assumed I wanted to do long term, not be in a operations based role, which when I looked at it afterwards, I'm like, actually, that's honorable that he looked at that and he saw it as though he was helping me, even though in the end it wasn't helpful for me at the time. But that was because I never made it clear what I wanted. And I think this becomes super important for individuals when they're thinking about advancement, but also from a leadership perspective, because when you understand why you're trying to do something and you could lean more into that, then it's also sometimes easier to articulate that to others. And I think it's really important as a leader, there's a switch that has to happen, because early on, that why is often about why you're doing it, but it might relate to yourself. Why I want more money for this thing, or I want to impress my parents, or whatever it is. But as you advance, you can still have that core reason. I think we all do. Everybody's looking for it on their own, but you need to start thinking about it in terms of how that why ties to your boss or the business objectives. Hopefully they could do both at the same time, but not always, depending on the boss's own agenda. But I think that became an important unlock as well, because the higher you climb, the more you're really thinking about like true business results versus managing to the tasks. And I think going through that transition is something that people really have to do as well. And I think with that too, something that gets unlocked then is for a leader when it comes to leading these teams is that clarity also helps them, because where a lot of leaders struggle, and it's less important earlier in your career, but it's really important as you know you're leading teams, and especially again as I was mentioning with leading global teams, because you don't have some of the same interactions from a time zone perspective, or in my case then it was I had, or the team had, the advantage that was local, that I was in the office with regularly versus global. So you have to think about that and how you're going to compensate for that as a leader, so that it doesn't feel like one team is more favored than the other. But really clarity around then the vision of where you want to take the team, where you want to take the department, becomes really important, because when you're in large companies like Disney or Netflix, there's a bunch of subcultures that exist. And I never realized that also when I was in a, like early in my career. It's like you just see, look, it's Disney, and it's, people have their things they think about Disney, and look, there's this great client service. Like they associate theme parks with like Disney at large. And that wasn't it. All of a sudden later, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's these subcultures. And if leaders aren't actually thinking about how they deepen their own culture, it's not going to be as healthy, and you're not going to get as much from the team. And I would say Disney and Netflix were very different companies in that regard. Netflix leaned heavily into their culture and tried to attach everything to that. Disney didn't actually actively put a lot of effort into core values in that. So for me, that was something else later on that I did with my own, leader at the time, is we started crafting our own set of core values, even at Disney, because we wanted to help point the team in a certain direction and really make sure that they were clear on that vision, which is where the candor and transparency can be really important. And those sometimes don't exist places. And I think some people think they have to be guarded as leaders, especially like as they climb the ranks. But it's like, no, actually, what could be extremely valuable is when people are, again, clear on that vision, and then really candid on multiple scenarios. One of them is, where you're going, how you're doing against it, so that everybody knows. The other one is so that there's clarity between, like, I love understanding what my team wanted to achieve, because if I could help them tie what they wanted to achieve to their career goals, it was a win for everybody. And I used to hate when we go through the process of performance reviews, because those performance reviews often felt like, all right, it's that time of year again, go through it. And it just felt very robotic. So for me, what I always try to do far in advance of that with my team is I would look at it and be like, no, I want you to, I've created something else. It's going to go through what you want. Like it was almost me working with them around their own goal setting and tying things together, because I wanted to see them achieve more. And I think that's another important thing. I don't think all leaders end up doing that, but I think the leaders that I had that I prefer, and those that I admire a lot, did a really great job of trying to enable and help the teams grow. It's this term, servant leadership, comes to mind a lot for me. And that's how I try to approach things. It's like, I see myself as there. This may sound like a horrible comparison, but I do sometimes think about it in sports. There's the great, I call it Olympic sport. I know they play it outside of Olympics, but that's the only place I ever see it, of curling. Most people wouldn't look, they're like, what, this isn't curling. But for me with curling, what I like about it is oftentimes a leader's job is as a sweeper. Like we're like, how do you move the barriers from the team so that they could get to where they want to be sooner? And don't get me wrong, it's important for an individual to be able to remove some of theirs on their own. But in the end here, I just try to think about it in those terms, because I'm trying to help them get to where they need to go by helping to remove the barriers. And for a leader, that sometimes mean the barriers are purely operationally driven, but oftentimes they're mental mindset barriers that the individuals face as well. So I think it's really important that leaders advance their own thinking in terms of, early on it's about you, later on it's about the team. You're playing psychologist in many ways, especially with a large team. So anyway, I'll take a pause there, but like those are some things that come to mind that I think are really important as people rise through and make shifts on.
You said so many good things that I'm going to unpack bit by bit.
Okay.
And I think I know that I really like, and it's just like so clear the way that everything, like there's so many moving pieces and they all come down exactly like you said, foundationally at the bottom, the emotional intelligence and
Mhm.
understanding the different people. And I really liked how you talked about the curl. It's funny, I'm Canadian. Curling is. I've never
Finally,
actually
somebody
seen
gets it. Oh
curling
yeah.
anywhere outside of the Olympics either, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's true. It's conversations I have with the leaders I work with as well, where it's like understanding your team's motivation is so crucial.
Yeah.
Even if maybe there's times where someone feels like maybe they're not ready to help them get promoted, or that person's not ready to get promoted, but like all that aside,
Mhm.
I'm a big advocate that understanding each team member's separate motivations is like foundational to who you are as a leader, because at the very least I always encourage my clients to tie it back into getting them to like just work better and increase their productivity. And if there's ever conflict and you need to address the conflict, you just tie it back into the motivations that you know they have, and it's
Exactly.
like
How much easier.
yeah, I love it. And I like also the fact that you talked about the difference between local teams and global teams and time zones. And it's something that I'm having more and more conversations around because everything is getting more global, more Zoomified,
Yeah.
more complicated. So maybe we can unpack that a little bit more.
Sure.
Considering how often companies are going remote and how global everything's becoming, what are some of the, let's say, misconceptions or faux pas that you have seen or that you see people doing that they think will get them promoted, but actually are harming them instead?
There's a few that come to mind. There's probably a lot more, so we'll see what else comes out. But some of it goes back to this idea here again of people like to show up sometimes, but they don't really show up. And what I mean by that, this is whether virtual or not, they might show face, but they're not necessarily driving results and impact, and they mistake the two together. There's the people, again, I've seen these in both remote and non-remote scenarios where you're like, oh, that person again, and they're sometimes really good about being like, hey boss, how are you, boss? And that gets you so far. At least you're not the hermit that they feel like they can't connect to. There might be some connection there, but I think eventually that ends up harming them if they're not also attaching it to clear results and driving those. Because so much about anybody's career and advancement is around positioning. And some people are choosing to actively position themselves in that way of, hey, at least I'm here. And then there's the other ones who are positioning themselves in terms of, hey, I'm here and here's what I've delivered that is going to help you do X, Y, Z. So I think that's an important one. And I think this is where that being able to lead yourself is so important too, though, is because what's happened a lot when people started going remote is those individuals that I was alluding to before that sometimes needed somebody to tell them what to do. That might not happen as regular as it would have in the past because you're not having the same, run-ins, conversations, tossing this project over this way to somebody. You have to make it more intentional. So I think when people aren't, it's almost like you can get those hallway run-ins where you could quickly be like, hey, this happened, so excited. Now you have to somehow get that across via a Slack or in the meeting with a boss, whatever it ends up looking like, or in some other presentation, but you have to do it more actively. I sometimes think about it in terms of video calls in general. You almost can't show up to a video call in the same way that you would show up in a meeting. And what I mean by that is like, I almost think about it like theater and acting. Sometimes theater actors have to turn it on a little bit more to come across the way that they would have been able to if it was in cinema and the camera's right up, in your face. Well, in this case, I feel like instead we have to do it a little bit more because people, when you're in a office, it's easier. You're not necessarily thinking when somebody's talking and you're looking and you're nodding. Well, here it's just not the same energy. So I think people have to realize that they do need to make sure that they're working a little bit harder to show up. And that can sometimes put people who aren't as vocal at a slight disadvantage. So I think that is something important that they consider. But once more, I think making sure that they have a method, whether they're remote or not, they need a method that they're going to deliver their wins on that regular basis. And I think that becomes key in making sure once more that they're tying to the business. I did see a few people during pandemic who you saw kind of drift away a little bit more. You're like, oh, yep, this person's, I don't want to say taking advantage of the situation. I don't think there was loads of that in my organization, but you could see that for them without, if they were the individual who required a little bit more regular direction, you could see where they struggled a little bit more within that. So I think just really key, understand the goals, understand what's being accomplished, and continue to deliver updates around those. And when people are on these calls, never turn off your camera. That's like one of the big ones. It shocked me still how much that happened regularly. And for a while there, it was considered more acceptable because people like they might have their kids in the background or whatever else, early days of pandemic. But now it's like people need to have figured, that out. And if you're on a call with a lot of people, I mean, there's programs that I'm involved in, and it's that same thing. Only 3 people sometimes have their camera on and 20 other people don't. Who's probably getting more out of that program? The ones who are really trying to connect that way. And I think it's the same thing in our careers.
Yeah, it's such a good point. When the pandemic hit, I was still getting my PhD back in school. And part of that, I had to work as a teaching assistant. And it was crazy to see how many students, of course, took advantage of that
Oh,
and
yeah.
just completely slacked. But it's true. And then after that, I worked at a consulting place for a little bit where I was helping medical professionals prepare for interviews as they were transitioning, like in between medical fields.
Yeah.
And it was very shocking to see the little details that are so often overlooked with showing up on camera, where it's like the angle of the camera is not optimized. It's like staring up at them, or it's like to the side. The room is a mess. Their personal things are all over the place. It was a little bit surprising, and it still is how often I see, like exactly as you said, like we should have all adapted by now.
Yeah.
And it's like the little things that make such an impact. And it's the little things that everyone notices. And like, even if you know you're home, it doesn't mean that your door should be open and your closet is visible and your clothes are thrown all over the place. And
Right.
the most common thing I see as well is like people forget. Like, I think it goes back to psychology, and even like bystander effect comes to mind, where it's like the more people that there are, the more you think you kind of like blend in. And then when there's calls, like people forget. They can see if you're sitting here like scrolling or like on your phone or
Totally.
browsing Amazon, like you're visible.
Especially people further disadvantaged there, the ones who wear glasses, because often you're seeing the reflection
Yes,
and you even know in
reflection.
that scenario. But no, I think what you said, I mean, that is so key because it's a set. Even for me, when I set up my office here, it was purposely because I wanted people to feel like I was still in one of the other Netflix offices taking the call. Even though everybody was pretty much working from home at that point and I knew it wasn't, I didn't want it to feel like, I don't know, the curtain in the background. I'm trying to think of, the best way to say it, in the dark room. It's like I wanted it to feel like it was purposely built to be a nice setup like you could find in an office, because I do think some of that matters. And maybe I went a little bit further with it, as we look at both of our backdrops and settings. But at the same time, it all depends on where you're at, because I think once more, as you were talking about climbing that ladder, I think, look, people might be okay with that person straight out of college with a white wall background, nothing going on there, like they're on. And if you're engaged, it's perfectly fine. But I think people have these expectations, right or wrong, as you advance, that, oh, you probably taken more time to care for the area in the background and everything else that you have there. And I do think that plays a role in it, and the cleanliness, everything. Somebody or somewhere where I read at one point, they talked about if you really want to know how a person approaches their work, and maybe this is unfair, but I'll still say it,
Mm,
take a ride in their car and see how their car looks,
I heard that. Yep.
Yeah, which I think those of us with kids, please don't hold it fully on us. We're trying to, but I do think that that's an interesting way to look at it. And I think, people were inviting that into their homes. And if you saw a bunch of clutter and other things everywhere, then I think that makes people think of you in a different way than the person who presents himself on. Much like clothing or how we show up in that sort of way too. It's like there's just a difference of showing that we care. You can do in little ways such as this.
Yeah. Yeah. I think It hurts a lot of people's feelings to say this, but at this point, it's like, it's a fact. People are judging you on your appearance and the way that you show up. And there's research to support it. Like, we're not making it up. If you've ever seen the trend on social media around like pretty privilege, like that is actually backed by research. People who are rated as good looking, people who are put together, people who take care of the appearance,
Yeah.
which includes yourself and your environment, people pick up on that like instantaneously and then rate you more favorably. So if you are looking for a promotion, let's connect the dots, right? Like appearance matters,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
No, it
Yeah.
is, and I think you're right. It is not the forbidden thing that people shouldn't talk about, because I think they should, but it is the thing that is avoided frequently. And sometimes, and this comes back down to, again, the self-awareness side, emotional intelligence. Some people might look at it and be like, that shouldn't matter, and this is how I'm going to show up. And it's like, okay, great. You might not be incorrect that it shouldn't matter, but it does matter. And if this is the way you show up, like I've coached some people in this way, I'm like, it's I can only help you so much if you're not willing to, like, take the advice and think about, because again, everything is about human psychology around you. And if you either lean into that or you don't, and each one of them is going to have an outcome. You just have to ask if you're okay with that outcome. Some people, and all the power to them, might be like, I don't care if that's what ends up happening. I am me. And in some ways I'm like, all the power to you if you can lean into the life and still get what you want to, achieve that way.
Yeah, yeah, it'll just be harder
Right.
because their psychology might be different, but the average person and the majority of people are following the same patterns.
Yeah.
And those patterns prefer organization and put togetherness and all those things. So,
Whether it's right or wrong too, I also
yeah,
think that once more, when people do look at that, and they'll sometimes think about that in terms of, okay, in the way that they're caring and thinking about themselves is also representative probably of some of their, work. Like there's these judgments that happen that sometimes they turn out true, sometimes they don't, but perceptions ultimately are going to roll so much. So it's like, yeah, I always told my team, I'm like, always consider the perceptions, always realize that you have a brand.
yeah,
I talk about it in terms of identity and image. Identity is how you see yourself, but image is how others are seeing you. And you're generally going to find yourself advancing in your career more based on image than identity. Now, that often means you have a chance to make sure that your identity is put out there a little more into the world if you want it to be, and it becomes more of your brand. But if you're not actively thinking about that, or if it doesn't connect with people, then in the end, again, whatever the image is being created of you is often going to dictate, at least within those specific realms of people and companies, what ends up happening with you. Because somebody could go somewhere else and maybe exactly what their vibe is works out in that other zone. And that's always a possibility. But once more, I think it is difficult to say, but people need to make sure that they're not ignoring it.
yeah, I think that's a very important point. And the disconnect that I often see there is that because we know our identity and because we know ourselves and we are living our perspective 24/7, we almost make the assumption that other people know things about us the way that we know them about us because this is our lived experience.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so people forget. And more importantly, there's always a disconnect between the identity and the image, but most people aren't aware of that.
Yep.
And so some of the things that I do with my clients is I'll get them to ask for feedback, or I'll get them to even start by doing something like recording themselves in a meeting and then watching it back. And the amount of times where people are like, that's what I look like. I had no idea. Because there is that disconnect.
Yeah. No, it's so true.
Yeah.
And I think what's so interesting with that, once more, whether in person or whether remote, like people may do similar vibes. In person, it might just be there on their phone over there, whatever it is. Maybe they're sending a work email, which is what they'll be like, which then gives them an out of some sort. But or at home, whatever they're doing. It may also be a work email, or it might be Amazon, or it might be anything else. And yeah, I don't think enough people even think about that in terms of the recording from any of the Zoom calls. And I really think actually people should look at that too, because it's a really good point for a few reasons. One, it helps you reflect on how you showed up in general. Like if you look at it like, man, would have I invited this person to the meeting the whole time? All they did there was nod their head, or they ended up, maybe at that point they were typing, you could tell, or their screen was off. It's like, because you want the invite to certain rooms. Don't get me wrong. Some meetings you don't want to be in, it's not worth it. But that's the other point of the reflection is time management, because it's like, if I contributed nothing to that, Like I would use that at some point to be like, hey, whoever is the leader of the meeting, I noticed I went back and looked at, meetings because I was trying to think about how, I was approaching these and noticed in the last three, I usually only had a small contribution that was equal to this thing. I actually think it would probably be more beneficial that I just sent that update right beforehand. Are you okay if I give this to the other person? Like, I think there's that side that's time management. I think there's the other side that says, how can I make sure I'm showing up to this meeting? Because it's got the people in it I need to make sure that I'm shining for. And I know what I just said there may also make some people uncomfortable because they're like, you're talking politics. And it's like, once more, image, identity, all of these things. I mean, if there are people, there are politics. And I don't like it if people promise that you never have to play politics
Mm.
because it's just the reality of humans. And sometimes, there is a level of back to the EQ, emotional intelligence thing. It's sometimes what you have to do is you need to be able to bring certain people, down from an irrational thinking. And that as a leader is necessary. And with that, yeah, sometimes you can just be honest and be like, what you're doing right now is completely inappropriate. There's this, but with the wrong person, that's just going to make the situation worse. So like sometimes you have to know how in that situation, okay, I know how I need to play this out. I'll talk to them later when it's not in the situation or where they don't feel attacked because I know how, they have to be able to think through those components. That does then require a level of politics because you're in essence, giving somebody not necessarily what you'd like them to have, that straight honesty around what they do, because now is not the time. And I think again, that's a really important thing. I know people talk about reading the room and trying to figure that out. And this is why, once more, going back to it, like we have to have enough self-awareness, self-management. Like I sometimes refer to it at times, like I know I've been in a meeting where this is happening and we can have the conversations in our head. Not that we aren't listening to the person, but there's that piece that I think a strong leader has where they're still like, okay, yes, right now I want to leap across this table or I want to tell them how I really feel or some, words that aren't choice are going to come out of my mouth. But instead, it's often the nodding and coming back to it and be like, I understand where you're coming from. Let's connect on this afterwards. Even though in your head, you're like, this person is irrational. They're crazy. Everybody else in there knows it too. And you want to do it. But like, that's such
Yeah.
a key aspect of it as well. Sorry, that was a bit of a tangent, but
No, it's a good one too, because I think it ties into this whole image thing and the emotional intelligence quite nicely because it is, I think, with leadership and the higher up you get, there's really this element of understanding that who you are needs to be tweaked and tailored a little bit more. And so some of the things that I hear is also like there's almost like this resistance to changing who people are. And it's like, I talk this way, or I want to respond this way, or like, this is who I am and this is how I do things. And it takes getting over yourself a little bit to be smarter about it, is I guess how I'll phrase it, where it's
yeah,
like, yeah, like it takes maturity, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Like it takes intelligence and maturity to be able to say, like, this is who I am, but this isn't how I want to be perceived in this context. And so, like, for
absolutely.
myself, growing up, I was very scrappy and I had a lot of attitude as a kid, and I would lean into that. And it was like, well, this is who I am. And like, I have no problem talking back, and I have no problem voicing my opinion. I have
Yeah,
no problem being opinionated in class. But then you get to a point where you're like, oh, this isn't who I want to be perceived as, because who wants the person that's going to fight you in every meeting every time something comes up?
right.
But it does take that self-awareness and that like acceptance to get past it.
Yeah, I agree. And it's really interesting because it's like that scrappy person you mentioned. In some ways, I'm like, sweet, you need a level of scrappiness because you don't want to also become I don't know, not a log, but you don't want to become.
Like a doormat.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Or even for that matter, it's like there's the yes person, which
Yeah.
look, in certain aspects of career, depending on who you're working for and if you're learning a lot in that, sometimes being a yes person isn't horrible because you are learning and growing so much as long as you can get to a path where you're breaking free from that and becoming, the person who's able to now make the calls on your own. But ultimately, it is that interesting thing when we think about it and go back to education and like that. Oftentimes the way that people are brought into careers is learning certain things that they have to unlearn, related to it's like, okay, back then there was more of the, raise your hand, memorize things, all these sort of stuff that doesn't necessarily translate into the real world experience, which is again why for me, one of my, just frustrations when I think about certain things when it comes to education in general. But so it's really important
in the scrappiness that you mentioned, it's like, I think there's a strength in there to that degree that it can allow somebody to be scrappy, but still be scrappy enough within the world that they're in. I think about guerrilla marketing sometimes. Like marketing, you take a certain approach to guerrilla marketing is how you find these other paths to get and achieve with what you know want and easier, at least my version of how I describe it. And I think, similarly here, I think it's super important that people do find ways that they can hold on to that identity, but still help manage the image. Because one thing that can happen in corporate America or life in general, whatever you want to say, is it absolutely happens where people over time, they start giving back to somebody a little bit of what they see. Sometimes that's for the better, sometimes it's for the worse. And if somebody was with a boss for a period of time or a department for a period of time that rewarded specific things, then you might have leaned more that way. And because of that, it could actually mean, like, when I left corporate America, part of my thing was I had to undo. I feel like a lot of
Mm.
my programming is the way that I look at it that ended up happening out of that. Much like you can have a level of programming that comes out of the typical educational system, although I know it looks different in different places. And I think that is an interesting thing when you consider it, because we are, for better or worse, continuing to kind of build these new habits around this. And then sometimes it's easy for people to lose sight about who they are. And this is why, once more, it feels like a commercial, I know, for emotional intelligence, but that becomes so important so that people don't lose who they are, while sometimes acknowledging that in the workplace, there is this balance. And I think about it in terms of, again, marketing at large. It's like, if you're trying to sell something to somebody, you can't sell it to them the way you want it sold to you necessarily, unless they're very much like you. Because if you do, they're not going to buy it. Instead, you have to figure out how you craft the things in the way that they want it. And a lot of career growth is about that positioning, much like marketing is about that positioning. And that does mean sometimes, like in some scenarios, especially those who are in sales and other jobs, that's going to require them to say hobnob, but, in essence, blend in with those clients. So they're like me. I love this person. I want to buy from them, and there's this fine line, people have to walk around that. But I do think that you can lose yourself if you're not careful. And who am I to say if that's better or worse? Ultimately, how do you feel in the end is what it's all about. But it's just something I've been thinking about a lot more recently, especially again, once I had left, where I suddenly realized now I'm like, oh man, like some of these things and the way that I'd approach it, I did it this way because this is the way that they would have preferred to. Or I was told before, different points when I worked with vendors at Disney, they actually said, man, you created this protective bubble, because I had this approach to how I managed my team, but also with the vendor relationships. And compared to others that they had worked with at the time, they could see the difference between my team and working with the other individual, because I still managed that balance to get what my boss at the time or the president of the group were looking for, but enough that because I tied it back to what it meant on a human level, it hit them all differently. Leadership in general is not always as good about dictating that why down, but that was something that I tried to do. And literally, when somebody described it to me as, you created this kind of protective bubble where it's like you've got this interesting team that's able to operate differently than what we're seeing from some of the other Disney teams, and they liked it, that meant a lot to me. I didn't know at the time exactly. I didn't think about it like that bubble, but it's
Mm.
true. I basically tried to take in whatever it was from leadership and others. Sometimes that was coming on even more emotionally strong, in the wrong ways sometimes. And I would then try to disseminate that back to a way that mattered to the other individuals. And sometimes things are laid on thicker to create more urgency and other stuff around it. I just tried to find the way to make sure it was attached to what mattered more to those individuals. And I think while I'm still in my own evolution of leadership and will be until I die, and your kids make you question whether or not you're a good leader after all in the end. but I think in those scenarios, it is something where I think there is this evolution that can happen where, despite these other, I always refer FHBs, valuable human beings, around us, people who might have moved into leadership positions, never really caring to lead people or never really learning how to do it. It's like, how do you dance with them while then still making sure that you can grow your own team?
Yeah. Such an important point. I want to unpack a little bit more. Um, Backtracking slightly. So, we all have a need to belong, right? Just like going back to the basics of psychology, like we all want to belong wherever we are at. And so, it's an interesting point you mentioned earlier on about how uh, Disney didn't really invest in culture. if that's, yeah, right. And so it's like, it's an interesting thing because there's still culture, right? Like there's
Absolutely.
still, right. And so it's an interesting place to be because wherever you are, especially someone who's like hired, if they're new, if they're aiming for leadership, like we're always looking at other people and we're always taking note of what the others are doing
Yeah.
and then sort of blending that with who we are to fit in, to copy that. And it is an interesting concept because people do lose themselves a little bit. And I find that the longer people stay within one specific organization, the more they mold to the way things are done there versus had they moved somewhere else, they would have been a different image, different person, different identity,
Right.
right? And it's an interesting concept. Like I can think back to myself when I was in grad school. One of the first times I saw a lab mate who was older than me would show up to like department meetings, just sitting on her laptop, like doing other things. And for me, I was like, oh, I guess that's okay. And so I would do that. And then I
Right.
learned very quickly that's not okay. And that's not the type of image you want to put out. But it's an interesting conversation because, as exactly as you said, as you were building this protective bubble that was seen so positively, it's almost like a clash in a sense, where it's like, on the one hand, everyone wants to fit in and belong. And if everyone else in leadership is doing it this way, surely I should be doing it that way as well. But then on the other hand, it's like balancing that identity and doing it your way and doing it better.
Yeah.
Like I'd love to unpack that more because it makes me think of someone specific that I've spoken to recently where it's like, I'm really encouraging them to do it their way. And it is interesting to find that balance, and it takes that inner self-reflection and it's like centering yourself and grounding yourself and knowing who you are and being able to back that up when you are doing it differently than how others are.
Yeah. It's an interesting balance. And
Yeah.
I think sometimes I think about it, this may not be the best comparison, but it came to mind is in the world of movie making, sometimes you have an actor who will make a specific big budgeted movie. And in
Mhm.
exchange for that, the studio will be like, sure, we'll fund your independent film, your passion project that you want to do. They don't have high expectations from it. They may lose some money on it, but because they think, they want this person making this other movie that's going to be the cash cow kind of movie, they're willing to do it. And there's this trade-off I think that happens in the workplace that can look similar and should, meaning that, like, I think about it in terms sometimes of deposits and withdrawals as it relates to like relationship. And that's not to make it sound transactional. It's just to look at it as when anybody's made a mistake, they know how big of a deal that's going to be when they've done nothing but deliver greatness for the person before versus when it's their fifth mistake in a row. And that's where I think about the deposits and the withdrawals. If you made a lot of withdrawals and you keep, doing things that are causing a lot of friction or challenges and other things, if your boss has to keep stepping in to say sorry to a client on, your behalf, it's like, okay, you're making too many of those. But if you make enough deposits that you've built it up so high, what eventually starts to happen is that people will say, okay, you know what they're doing is working. And even if you're taking something that might look like a withdrawal because you're doing it different than they would have liked to, they can't, it's hard for them to question it because they like the results that they're getting from you. And then if you do find yourself floating away from the shoreline, they often at that time too will also be like, they look at it with more understanding because again, you've done so many wonderful things. So I sometimes think about it in terms of like that balance of making sure that you are delivering enough so that when you do try to zag when everybody else is zigging, that it's not something that gets too much, I don't know, negative attention and press in the workplace, for lack of a better way to put it, and informs the image that way. I also think that for me, like if I think about some of the best leaders that I had, the candor I appreciated because they would be straight up with me. And I tried to do the same with my team. And they would say, well, look, here's what so and so wants to achieve. Look, we know it's crazy, or we know that this is difficult, or we know that this is it. But ultimately, we want to try our best to be able to get there. Let's stretch ourselves. You turn it into almost this thing of you've acknowledged the elephant in the room about what they're
Mhm.
doing, but now you've also acknowledged it, said, look, let's do this because as soon as we can, as soon as we want to go back and, do this thing here, or at least they'll see that it was total effort. We're going to go out of our way to make sure we dog and pony this a little bit more. And everybody sees that, it's like, haha, look at it. And again, not trying to fake it, but trying to just do the reality that sometimes somebody is asking you something that's crazy. But guess what? Sometimes that craziness actually turns into the result, and it turns out they were right, and you were looking at them thinking the whole time that they were crazy. But in the end, it's like, no, they saw something that we didn't in our own capabilities. They pushed hard enough. We figured out a way to do it. So that's where there's always this balance. And even when I think about, and as I look at and call out those difference between a company like Disney and Netflix, no matter where you're at, every company has a culture. Some of them are more renowned for their cultures, some of them in a good way, some of them negative way. It's like people look at working with Elon Musk and they're like, okay, yeah, sleep under your desk sort of scenario. There could be, these things. Whether that's the full story or whether that's just makes it to the press, who's to say? Steve Jobs also had, rumors that went around about how tough he was on people. But then at the same time, there's also a lot of people who speak about how that really helped him grow. Walt Disney, in his own way, had these, things. They used to have what they called the sweat boxes, which were these little tiny theaters that they would use to review the animated films or any movies they were making in the day. And what would happen is he would go into these little tiny rooms, projector would be on, they'd show their stuff, and they'd wait for his feedback, which is like, these artists, as they did that. And they were nicknamed sweat boxes, partially because people were in there sweating, being like, what's Walt going to think about, what we're doing? So I think in the end, though, what happens in those scenarios is we even say that at Disney. Well, Walt Disney created a culture at the time that was very much about this quality of work. And then he tried to take that to like the theme parks and build that out. And he naturally created this culture. And I think sometimes you can, as leaders, like especially as founders, because you are the culture, you as a leader are also disseminating or magnifying. People are seeing you, and that's what they're taking. And similar with Musk. So he will attract a lot of people who think in terms of these big bets and these moonshots and these things that we're going to do because, wow, that's exciting for them. So I think that can't always happen. But I think as a company is around a longer time, the culture becomes this really interesting thing that leaders really have to actively try to shape. And when I think about it in terms of Bob Iger, who I think was an incredible leader, and talk about somebody who's poised and knows how, because, when he's making his media appearances, other things like that, he's so well spoken. He looked at culture, and the way it boiled down, at least what got to people, a few levels away from him, was more in terms of, okay, we're going to focus on quality. We're going to focus on technology. We're going to focus on global, which in those terms, you're like, all right, you get it. And it's like, let's go. But it's such an interesting difference between a company like Netflix that really develops and focuses on its core values. Because in that case, it's like, no, here's who we are. And then things strive from the who we are and how we think to the thing we're going to achieve. And I can't say either is wrong. I will say that Netflix, when a lot of people doubted them and the ability of the streaming platform, has obviously gone with these bets and changes they keep making, and they do them pretty quick because they've created this nimble environment. But at the same time, Disney's obviously one of the best, if not the best run media company in the world. So it still has worked well for them. There is still this level of culture that exists, but it's the difference about how far people want to really lean into shaping those. And honestly, when I left Netflix had started drifting a little bit away from there ever since Reed Hastings stepped away as CEO, even though Ted Sarandos is his co-CEO for a while there, and he's been with it for such a long time. There's still this difference sometimes when you have that founder. And I think I'm going somewhere with this, I promise you. I think what can happen for a leader, whether their team is 5 people, whether their team is 100 people or 1,000 people or a giant company, is you have the chance to be that founder leader for your subset of the group. And back to that bubble, to this degree that I mentioned, like you can still craft and create that. And like, I definitely tried to do that within my organization. And I think it gave them a big advantage because Disney in particular, my group saw at least, I forget, I need to look at my numbers again on it, but at least 3 times more promotions on average than any of the other teams. And that was a big part of pushing them in a way that was more aligned with them. Some of what we talked about before about what they want to achieve, involving them more, creating a lot more transparency in the things that I did so that they were aware of it, trying to tie what they were accomplishing more to the goals and what it would mean for them. And it helps when they start seeing these promotions, raises, other things happen in that scenario. But I think some leaders think about it in terms of, oh, my hands are tied. And there's always some of that. But how do you still create, that culture that you want, especially for those, I don't want to call them undiscovered leaders, but there's a lot of leaders in companies who are actually really good at leading but they haven't fully broken out yet. And
Mm.
some of them are waiting for the title and other things to do too. And I think it's really important that they instead look at it and just start leaning into that internal leadership, however you want to say, because you can create these amazing subcultures within these other companies. Whether the other companies have great cultures, okay cultures, you can still create this even within that. And I think it's really important for people to lead into their sometimes the gut when it comes to that, because
Mm.
leadership is rarely taught in organizations. It's often mirrored.
Sure, I agree with that. I think whether you want to admit it or not, whatever team you're running always has its own subculture anyway.
Absolutely.
So, okay, cool. Lost my train of thought for a second. Okay, so then sort of going off this point and then backtracking for a second, when it comes to people then wanting to show the impact of what they're doing, right? Arguably, is it as simple as showing up in the meeting and saying, "This is what I've done this week"? Or is there like what's the nuance to it? Like what's the art of doing it? And then also what advice would you add for the people who are like, I'm humble and I hate showing up and bragging about it?
Yeah, I get all that because that was me, still
Yeah.
me. Honestly, becoming a leader makes a lot of that actually easier, even though it might sound counterintuitive, because I rarely meet people who are humble or the person you described who don't also like lifting up others. Usually I find more humble individuals, they also like to give credit to others. And as a leader, what was great for me is I was able to start promoting myself by promoting my team, by promoting my cross-functional partners and others, because now you're able to give them shout outs. And when that happens, it lifts you up as well, especially if it's your own team, because ultimately you're leading the team. So it's like this win-win, the way that you can give them the exposure that they require while at the same time exposing yourself. And I think that that's kind of one step and one thing I would say around it in trying to figure out how you approach it in that way. I think the other thing too is that some people, they look at like promoting their work as if it's like sales are sleazy or like they shouldn't have to. And like, look, I
Mm.
get it. I'm still that person who thinks of car salesmen as people who are like, even though in the end here is somebody who's just, trying to earn for their family and take care of them. It's like but by the nature of that, sometimes that's this thing that makes it, people feel like it's more like desperate, not honest. And I think in the workplace, there's a couple of different things I recommend to both my clients and that I did regularly. So one of those, aside from trying to celebrate the others, is the wins. So I had what I called weekly wins or monthly wows, and depending on the person I was presenting them to, I may or may not have called them that. But part of that was I had my own team capture theirs that they would then bring to me, and some of them did this better than others. And while I always nudged and pushed, I would be honest with them that, look, whenever these come in from you that's articulating these, it's going to be so much easier to get you where you want to go, because I'm going to summarize some of these and bring them into my own meeting with my own leader. And sure, could have I put a lot of those together without the individual having to go through the effort of capturing them? I could have, but man, the things that I realized sometimes that came up on those things that I would have missed, because when you're leading large teams, if it's 100 people, you can't exactly always remember like, oh, the 100 people, they each did 10 things this week. All of a sudden that adds up very quickly where you're like, okay, I can't report on these 1,000 things. So or even stay on top of the 1,000 things. Instead, you're leading from a different place, usually towards key metrics or big projects that you're trying to do. But between them doing that and between me keeping my own, what I would do whenever I had my weekly meeting with my own leaders, I would come in and I would have boiled those down in this way that was good and kept him in his own loop, progress on things he cared about. And then whenever we could, I hit the others. And at one point, I had, in fact, most of the times I would say what I broke out, if we couldn't get through those in the meetings, I would still deliver them over to the leader afterwards. And they would still sometimes come back with some other questions. Like they'd look at it because they really enjoy it, because it was super helpful for them. And it gave them something they can then take to their own leader to be able to talk about the things that were being accomplished as well. And I also had my team incorporate some things in there that would probably seem a little abnormal around a few things that might be, if they wanted to in their life, something, one of them be like, oh, my son's getting married, this, that. Because what was also great for that is between that or between some of their own team members, if they were open to say that, it allowed myself, it allowed my boss at the time, and even sometimes the president of the group, because if we thought it was the right thing, we'd put it on their radar too. They would be allowed when they were walking by and be like, hey, I heard, congratulations. And that means
Mm.
so much to a person. And we're not trying to do it in some sort of like cheating this, like we meant it still from the heart. It's just you had to surface what it was. But when somebody could get that, you're unlocking this other key thing with leadership, which is trust. Because absent of trust, leadership is it's not there. It's absent. It's very difficult because you people follow a leader because they choose to. They report to a boss because they have to. And to evolve from being a boss to a leader, you need to be somebody that people trust. So the way that conveyed that was, one key way for me that I do this. And then usually the other way that I would do it, either for myself or my team, is if we're working on a big project, you can deliver, depends on what the frequency needs to be, monthly, something like that, really high level updates for people. Dashboards are nice, especially depending on who you're talking to, the level and that stuff. But just to have that chance to present, hey, quickly, just want to let you know, in that same one, you have the chance to call out a few of your cross-functional partners, others. People don't get celebrated enough. So the fact that you're able to do that either in a meeting or in this document, but then show them a few things, and you win two ways there. One, you win because most people don't do that effort, and just doing that effort is going to make you or your team stand out. And then two, the reality is oftentimes those updates people need because everybody's really busy. So being humble actually robs the group and the department of things like, staying in the know and of celebrating others. And like for me, once I made that switch, and if people can make that mental switch, you actually realize that what was uncomfortable before can actually be more uncomfortable now if you don't do it, because you are literally taking these things away that are going to help other people, which most humble people would also care enough to want to help the other people.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. I always say, like, it's way more awkward to not say it and then leave them wondering or coming back to you. But I love your point about the human connection. I think that's extremely important. It reminded me of a little horror story. I worked at a pharmaceutical company for a couple of years before I went to grad school.
Uh-huh.
And there were a few reshuffling things going on, a lot of sort of drama in my final days when I was leaving. And on my last day, even though I had spent like 2 years working side by side with a ton of people who had like moved departments over,
Yeah.
not a single person said bye to me,
Hmm.
except for my manager, who was no longer my manager, but she remembered and she came over and she like brought me a card and she said bye. And I was like, it went such a long way, because it's like the bad impression that it left me with, where it's like I spent 2 years and
Yeah.
my current manager couldn't even say bye to me.
No, I think, and you know what? And I think that's something too that's important for people to consider, because like people invest a lot of time, with companies, with careers and that. And look, even with the time I spent, there are individuals that I stay in contact with, but a lot less than you would think of. This thing for me that I realized, somewhere mid career for me, especially at Disney, as people left and stuff like that, is whenever people are like, keep in touch, or hey, let me do this. I'm like, look, if we never even hung out while we were both at the company, nothing's happening now. So I'm not going to feed you the niceties that make it sound like I'm just like, yeah. And maybe that makes me less likable in that scenario, but I'm just like, sure, I might still be like, yeah, but it's like, I know what's going to happen here. And I think in this case, when it comes to large companies, it sounds horrible, but we usually all have some sort of an ID or number that's attached to us in these companies. I was like at Disney 05432. It's like, it feels like a prison number, honestly. But like in the end here, it's like most people within the company itself is not going to remember you, but ultimately you're not. And I say that only because it's like, people need to make sure that whatever they're doing, the decisions and stuff that they make, still that they're still thinking about it in terms of what's best for them. Because in the end, like that was something for me that just made me really realize, oh yeah, it's like we put so much weight on this and we don't want to leave people thinking, I don't know, poorly of us, whatever it is. True, you don't want to burn bridges, but it's like at the same time, most will never ever remember. And that, and the other big breakthrough that I had too, that I think is important for anybody who's, growing into leadership roles to remember, is the higher I actually got up, the more I realized, most of these people are making it up. It's like, it's not, it's like you think they have the answers because oftentimes we associate people in these powerful positions or certain titles or other things as they must know. But what I realize is no, you know what? The same instincts that oftentimes early in our careers when we're like, how should I approach this? Well, I think this is probably the best way. Let's take a swing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And that's the nature of it. And when you hire, you get up to companies, oftentimes it's just that known thing. It's like, again, I put it in movie terms in some ways, but it's like, okay, green lighting this movie or this movie. You can choose to have lots of movies go into production. Some of them are going to hit, some are going to not. And eventually, yes, after enough years, if you just green light flops, it's going to be this thing where people are like, okay, maybe they don't know what they're doing. But the reality is you can still have multiple failures as long as you had enough things you succeeded in or that was successful around there. And I think, again, the workplace, that is just an important thing for somebody to acknowledge and know, because there's this intimidation that can sometimes come when people are interacting with people at these levels. And then in the end, though, when you just really realize that, no, they're going to go into a room, they're going to take the data, they're going to make their own, guess. And sometimes you could be in this room with them. And if they acknowledge that you're the expert, which a good leader can do, then oftentimes anyway, they're going to be like, okay, and this is why you're doing it. Like, they have a good way of thinking through your logic criteria. But in the end, they're like, okay, yeah, let's go with that. And you're like, wait, like, who made that decision? But people, it's so easy to, again, just think about them as it's about the best leaders that I've had. They've even admitted that, oh yeah. And I admit it for myself. So many times you're just like, sure, let's take this bet. This sounds like a good thing. Don't know if it's right or wrong. And I'm hoping that helps some people, because it does just put it down to each person, being a human, making the decisions based on the experience and criteria that they have, pulling the right experts in the room. And ultimately, that's all we can do, is make the right decision based on that. It's just, the key is make sure you're consulting the right people. And I think that's what, again, really great leaders could get really good at. And they have to, because otherwise they can't scale themselves to continue to grow and lead people.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It reminds me of an interesting study I came across where someone interviewed or took a look at like all the top like CEOs and executives, and they found that those that listened to their gut had better results, which can interesting. Like, your gut goes a
Yeah.
long way, I guess.
And I think the key there still is, it's like, the gut is good. I think to finally make that decision, I think what starts to happen is, if you surround it and you pull yourself from these right individuals, they get you just enough that you need that. Yeah, there's this crazy intuition thing that can happen where all of a sudden,
Yeah.
like, you could connect these dots. And that is one big advantage as somebody continues to advance. I mean, for me, I was pulled in when I was, again, late 20s, low 30s, into a group that was made up of I was director at the time, made up of all, SVPs, presidents, VPs. And I was the youngest person in the room by at least 10, 15 years. But being invited in that room and all of a sudden being like, oh, wow. Like, first off, yeah, you just see, okay, normal people here. There's some of that. But at the same time, you start to hear higher level conversations. It starts to make it a lot easier to connect what you're doing, and to realize what you were thinking you were doing was important is like not, and this is why you were invisible, for a period of time there, is because they're talking about things and playing at this whole other level that you weren't thinking about. And I think that's another important thing for people to consider as they are looking at growing as leaders or advancing their career either way, is that there's a book called What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And I think it's super important for people to consider that when you enter your career, you're in more of a task-based producer, you're getting those things done. But as you do advance, then it becomes, how do you orchestrate people to do it? And then, beyond that, it becomes really heavily focused on the strategy and how you drive the strategy. You're still driving the people, but you're setting more of the culture level and the strategy, which then your next level team is often the ones who are then, working on the managing of the people who are executing. And then again, back to test level. But I think you have to be able to evolve through those stages, which then requires that you're looking at projects differently. You go from the person who's like, I'll take it on, to, oh, okay. And this is a transition I made. I'm like, I don't have the bandwidth to do this, but these projects are interesting. Let me partner with this person over here. And they'll, it's basically, it was delegating before I had the leadership or title role, but it helped both of our careers and moving into leadership and this sort of thing. But there's ways that you can pull upon, other individuals, and you have to start thinking that way, because eventually, again, you have to move into that more manager mentality where you're managing the people. And then eventually from there, I remember hitting a point in my career where people are like, well, yeah, but you got to be strategic. And like, to me at the time, you're like, but I am strategic, I'm doing these things and these, and you are to a level, but not strategic at that point usually then means that you're tying things to these big company level goals. And I think the sooner people can unlock that, the better. But you got to be careful. What's the way to say it? There's probably a fun way to say it, but you want to make sure that you're not like, there's this balance between showing up. If you showed up at that early level and you're trying to act like the, high level executive already, you're not going to fit in. And even though you may be far advanced for your own, it's going to be hard for there. Now, you might be able to do better over at a startup where they're going to do that, but it's going to be hard because you have to figure out how to play at the role you're on to get to the next role, so that then you can start showing up in this other way. Unless you could have some unique magical elevator experience where you show up somehow, pitch something to the executive that they're like, this person's brilliant. Where have they been? Come into my organization. But chances are low for that.
Yeah. No, sure. I like that. I think what I see a lot of is that initial step into leadership where they go from, I'm amazing at doing all these tasks, to I have to tell other people what to do. And one of the things that I really help people work through is the identity piece, like we talked about, where it's, this is uncomfortable, this is icky, I don't want to tell people what to do, I'm micromanaging, like they can figure it out. And I feel like it's exactly what you said. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of the personal development never ends. And it is the constant evolution. And it just makes me think of like the stages that you talked about. It's, you're doing your bachelor's and then you get promoted to leadership. And like now you're doing your master's and then you want to keep going. Well, you have to figure out your PhD level, like leadership experience. And it's the same thing. It's like the evolution of you as the role evolves as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's and again, where I'm the proponent of the idea of, if you look at every organization, they're going to have there's, I think, as you just described it, like there's that common flow of it. Within that, I always have people look at like, what's the unique promotion criteria within their department, within the organization, because that's where those rules started. But because being a certain company, like it wouldn't have been abnormal that Netflix might have had that person at that lower level who is coming in with a couple years out of a consulting firm and, has their MBAs, however else you want to say it. Like this could be somebody, heck, they could have already started and sold a company. Like, so like they could be that mentality. And in that case, in that culture, it's like, you know what, this person can actually probably see themselves a rapid rise because the company thought more startup style over there. Whereas at another company, Disney as that example, that's where there would be this interesting balance and you'd have to find your way to do so. But yeah, no, it's so key. And it's so key to really just understand. And again, back to the whole emotional intelligence, like what's happening around you so that you can make sure you're managing yourself to properly position yourself for what you want to achieve. Or sometimes the answer is leave, because that's the other thing is I think it's really important for somebody to know when they need to leave themselves out the door because they're having to because it's just not the right fit for who they are and what they ultimately want to accomplish. And I think that's where a lot of entrepreneurs are sometimes born, because some of them realize like, I can't have this person tell me what to do here in this scenario because they already know that that person's making it up. And they're like, well, if I were going to do that, I could go do it here. And not to say, I mean, entrepreneurship in its own right is difficult. And as you managing your own entrepreneurial world and me doing mine, heck, in some ways, that's yet another one of the evolutions we talk about all this, because self-management then becomes this whole other thing, because it can be a beast, but it all roots down to the same thing still about what we've decided we want to do, how we're going to show up to accomplish that thing that we're going to do, and what we're willing to sacrifice sometimes, I think, is the other important thing that has to be considered. Because look, a leader or an entrepreneur, however you want to say it, but taking it back to the workplace, I've worked for a lot of individuals who they were a leader and they were really protective with their time, meaning it honestly, the balance that they had in some cases was like, wow, oh, okay, you don't really have a lot on your schedule right now. And you're spending time during the day, at the gym. But when they did so, they'd be reading one of a report or preparing for something they were going to go in and do an important presentation around. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not calling them a slacker, but that was their style of how they managed it. And when they showed up and they were on. You had some other people who would work long hours, and that was their approach to it. And I think some people, will look at things and they think, all right, what's the right balance of what you need to do as a leader and how you got to put it? Now, some of that has to do with culture, but I think a lot of it has to do with the expectations you set as a leader as well. Meaning that if people expect from you because you've shown them that you're the person who's always going to work these long hours and do this, and this is how you get it done, then you get known for that. Now, I actually think as a leader, sometimes that can limit you eventually because, are you a doer or are you somebody who's having a team and working on it in that way? But I do think it becomes really important that people think about it in terms of if they want to accelerate some of what they want to do, sometimes there is a benefit to putting in some more time to think sooner. You can learn if you're trying to learn faster and collect those type of skills. If you want to lead teams and you actually start to take on projects that give you the opportunity to do that, you might have to squeeze yourself a little bit. But I think in doing so can help people who really want to go down that pathway accelerate the lights, on that are going to get them there.
Yeah, I like that. Okay, so for everyone listening, then, what is something practical they can do? What's something they can audit about their leadership, their current working style, their current way of talking about their goals? Like, what's something practical we can leave them with to then consider if they're on the right path?
I'm going to give a couple of things and probably cheat here, but the most important thing I think that they can do is most people don't actually have a weekly reflection point when it comes to their career. And I think if they just set that, whenever it is, if you want to keep it on Monday, keep it on Monday. I always preferred to have that be something I would do like Sunday afternoon or something like that, or before I went to work. And because I knew what it was I wanted to achieve in some high level goals, which that's the part where I'm cheating because I'm like, it's good for people to understand that about the growth. But I would go through and I would basically do this audit where I would basically be like, all right, based on where I'm at now, how are the relationships that I need based on what I'm trying to achieve? The projects that I'm working on, am I working on the right projects that are going to get me to where I need to go? I'm trying to think of a couple other criteria I'd put in there. I'd look at my calendar then for the week and make sure things all lined around that. And by doing that weekly, it would really help me to make sure there's this concept of called the 1 in 60 frame. So the idea here is, if an airplane is not constantly doing these adjustments, little by little, they start drifting off course. And I think about it the same way for people and what they want to do in their careers. And like, ultimately, if you're not doing these regular reviews, then you're going to drift off course. And pretty soon you're going to realize you're somewhere you never wanted to be, which happens to a lot of us in our careers. So that's probably the most important thing I would do. But of course, with that, what becomes really important is the clarity around where you want to go so that is more meaningful, because I like to have people then, I usually work with clients on something I call horizon framework, where I'm like, okay, let's look out. I know it's far in advance, but let's look out 20 to 30 years in advance. Usually I say 20 years, then let's back that out to, okay, 10 years. And what do you need to achieve? 5 years, what would that look like? And now finally, based on your 5-year goals, some people like to go to 3 in between, but otherwise I say for 1 year, what do you want to achieve? Based on that weekly meeting you have with yourself ultimately reflects on that. Now, at the end of the year, you'll go and you'll reflect on that horizon framework again. You may change things, perfectly fine. I recommend you don't change them throughout the year constantly, because if you do, you're just shiny objecting all along. But to me, that's it. Like having time set aside and move towards it. And wherever they then understand, the skills would have been the other, thing to reflect on weekly. Am I learning the skills I need to? Well, that's where people can ask themselves and say, okay, where am I struggling now? And, for example, if it is around the idea of they're struggling specifically within leadership, or they could use additional coaching around this, or there's this book they need to read, like that, then they could set actively. And then every week they got to ask themselves again how they're doing against that. So that would be the key thing. But I have to sneak in one more, which is really important too, that sometimes people overlook. And that's the meeting with their boss. Some people are like, well, oh yeah, no, my boss, we connect and I meet with them once a month. Hey, I don't even think I met with them 2 months now and we're good. I'm like, no, you're not good. Like, you should strive at least in every other week meeting with your boss. Now, granted, maybe there's someone out there where it doesn't exist exactly like that, but the being able to true up and sync up where you're at and what you're trying to accomplish, making sure they're in the loop is really important. I have had bosses before where they would push out, or, hey, let's skip our meeting this week with one of the other team members. But I rarely had them do that with me. And the reason why is I was bringing so much value into those meetings, and that's your chance to shine. So I think that if people can make sure that they're showing up there in those ways to work on things that are important to their boss, tie their goals to the business goals and what the boss is doing, I think that becomes so critical. So again, slipping that one in too, just because it's like, that's also where you're going to get the feedback. that help to true up your identity and image. And I think between that and between this sort of weekly like reflection, those alone should send somebody down at least the
Yeah.
pathway of understanding exactly where their gaps are to be able to get to wherever they want to go.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think self-reflection, especially on a weekly basis, is overlooked way too much. And something I've heard is it almost feels silly to look at the same thing every week. But I like how you touched on that because it is. It's like the airplane analogy, right? You're just not course correcting because you think you're being silly, and then next thing you know, it's 6 months later, and you're like, "Oops,
Yeah.
what
Or
happened?"
right. Or for some people, 6 years later, and this is where,
Yeah,
you start talking about whatever, midlife crisis, anything else later for people, because they continue to drift sometimes, I think for a while there. And some people will then have some wake up call or realization. Sometimes you got to break down before you break through. But it's like I prefer to be able to look at that and actively manage it. And I think again, both of those examples all still tie back to that self leadership approach, because you need to be taking yourself where you want to go. You need to be making sure you're regularly getting that feedback. And I might not have emphasized that enough too, but I think that's kind of a key piece, is making sure that you have that group of people you're surrounded by who will give you that candid feedback. Hopefully it's your boss. You want to foster that relationship. Doesn't always exist perfectly there, but if not, you got to think about the other people within the organization who might, or like who's that coworker or, friend, but not the one that just tells you what you want to hear, the one that's going to really be there to say, no, dude, I saw how you came across in that. And, oh no. Okay. Thank you for telling me. It's almost like it's another way to have that self reflection. It's not you, but it's somebody else who's able to, who you trust, and you're okay with saying that. Not like, I'm trying to think about the way to say it. Sometimes in relationships, the other person doesn't really want you to tell them, what it
yeah.
is. For me, that's been a huge benefit, is when I've been able to find those people who would tell me it straight, because it's just a shortcut to faster growth.
No, I like that. I always say we should all be friends with feedback because we are doing the things that we're doing. And again, there's always that disconnect between who we think we are and how other people see us.
Yeah,
And if we're not getting that feedback, everyone else is seeing it anyway,
exactly.
which is arguably worse. So,
Exactly. Totally there.
yeah. Okay. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share?
I'll just reinforce, just for people to understand where they want to go. Hey, it's perfectly
Mhm.
fine to, and where I'm going with that is just self-reflection on at least understanding when people come out of school, like meaning like high school, they often
Yeah.
choose careers not even based on understanding themselves enough, but based on what others have asked and said of them. And now, if we go way back then, it's like, sure, test as many things as you can beforehand. Pivots are okay, but often we know earlier on that the pivot should be something that we're doing, but we're not in touch enough, with ourselves, for lack of a better way to do it. I was just talking to a friend who's actually built out this really interesting thing, which could be a whole nother conversation, but where he's captured so much of he's basically almost taking his journaling on his
Mhm.
morning walks, putting him into this thing he's created. It's like a second brain using AI, and then he will talk to it and channel it in this way. He's also working with a couple therapists. He'll clarify. So he's like, it's not just machines. But what's been so interesting about that is the reflections he's been able to have back at himself. So
Mm.
whatever it takes for people that I think have these like self reflections. It's also, by the way, for him, because he's content creator too. It's like helped him with this content creation, because it's like he's there. Everything is in there, which is really interesting, because so many people, when we create content, sometimes people are struggle to find their voice. And it's like, no, he's dialed it in this really interesting way, because he's captured all these voice notes. But I think the idea there, whatever that reflection is super important for people to consider. And while you might change your direction of where you want to go, I am a big believer in still having a sense of what that direction is, really focusing on it and learning about yourself in the process. And I think about it sometimes dating. In life, it's like I might have been with somebody over here, and I've been married 20 years now, but I was, with somebody for 3 years. I was with somebody, for a year, 3 years. You learn so much about yourself sometimes in these relationships, as long as you're also in this odd way giving your all to it. And I think, again, the same thing can work when we're thinking about it in terms of career and the growth that we're trying to do there. And I think that's where, again, this ability for people to reflect and really think about it is extremely important.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's a simple switch to go from like this sucks, it didn't work out, to like now I know what I don't want to do.
Exactly.
That's all it takes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but the more you do that, it's kind of like, again, I'll jokingly think about speed dating in those terms or something like that. It's like, but you had to get yourself in a position where you speed dated somebody to know what you don't want or what you do like. And I think that's why there is the speed that can sometimes be, or yeah, a value of trying to move towards that thing faster so that you then know if that's the thing you actually want to move away from. But the longer you take otherwise him and hawing around it, I just feel like,
Mhm.
I think maybe I'm wrong about this, but I think that's a lot of what leads to some of the self-regret and other stuff later in life, because people then feel like they weren't true to themselves. And all of a sudden, the person who they think they are is actually not the person that they are. They've held this identity,
Yeah.
but it doesn't look like who they actually wanted to be at that point. And I think that's what causes those like, where am I? What have I done moments, which, hey, however you get there, I'm still happy to get there. But if you could get there without as much pain, or at least with organized pain, if that makes sense, of taking these little shots and bets and then determine what you want, I think that is valuable in leadership, in career advancement, in life in general.
Yeah. I love that. I feel like that's a whole other conversation that we will have one day, but it's true. It's like we all get to that point where time has gone by and we're not who we thought we would be. And
Yeah,
sometimes we're not where we thought we would be. And that's okay. And it's just like you can take it and you can suffer or you can do something about it.
that's exactly it. And I think that piece of it there too, and I think this is so critical for people to consider, is that I'm big on this concept of between just ownership in general around whatever anybody's doing. And I think that's probably a better way to articulate some of what we're saying here in some ways too, is if people just own it, like that's the
Yeah.
key. And in the career, it's the same thing, and how you approach things. And as you advance as a leader, it's because you own it. And
Yeah.
there's people can choose the victor or the victim mindset. And the victim mindset is the one who says things are happening to them, at them, however you
Yeah.
want to say it. Whereas the victor looks at it and says, okay, this happened, but here's now what I'm going to do. And it is the key difference I see between people advancing into leadership typically
Mm,
and not, because the difference is, I've been in so many meetings where somebody be like, okay, well, this went wrong. What happened? And quickly you could have some people that are like, so and so this, or look, I don't know. I did my piece over here. And instead, for me, I find the easiest way to sometimes answer these, I listen to them at times. I'm like, okay, sounds like it was probably related to this, like looking at whatever the root was, mismanagement time, whatever it was. Like, and even if it was on me, I'd be like, look, I remember once I sent vendor pricing to the wrong vendor, meaning they saw another vendor's pricing. It's like, oh, I'm like, okay, here we go. Is this the end of my career? This was
yeah.
early in my career. But no, instead, what I did is I took that, I owned it, and I turned it into a new process. It actually streamlined it for everybody, the vendors, the team, while creating the transparency that was required, because now it shifted some of that effort to the vendors who were better at it than we were anyway. And like, it turned it into a win. And I think that difference there, and for people to say, look, even if this wasn't it almost doesn't matter if it was your fault. Usually when leadership's looking, they're looking for ownership in terms of, okay, do we at least know where it was rooted so it's not going to happen again? Now, what are we going to do and put in place, going forward? And I think a victor looks at that and says, oh, okay, yeah, here's what happened. Here's how we're going to avoid it going forward. Let's go. And quickly, that's the person who gets remembered. Even if
Mm,
you were the one who made the mistake, you're getting remembered for the thing that you end up implementing afterwards. So I think, again, that victor mentality, not pointing fingers everywhere, instead just understanding it and trying to look at how you resolve it is key. And I think that's a way to earn a lot of respect too with the team, because most mistakes, yes, humans might be involved, but there's usually a broken process. And when people can focus back on that and then move it forward, that's all anybody wants to do is move forward. But it can't be like my kids now, I'm working with them on this, who instead say, it wasn't me, even though I'm like, I got you on
mm.
video.
Yeah.
But,
It's true. Yeah, victim mindset. I'm a very tough love person, so victim mindset is one of the hardest things for me to sort of to coach people through because it's one of the most annoying things.
yep.
Like, sorry for saying that, but it's true. It's like no one wants to be in a room with someone who's yeah, but excuse this. Oh, me, poor me. Like
Exactly.
it's yeah, it's not conducive
No.
versus yeah, it's like I think it's scary for people to make the switch to accountability and responsibility, but it's exactly as you said, when you do, all of a sudden you're a superhero that's bringing solutions and being remembered
Yeah.
better versus it feels easy to be like, "Hey, it's not my fault."
Right. And you're
And then no one likes you.
exactly. And you're spending a lot
Yeah.
less time in that negative place by doing that too. Cause for me,
Yeah.
I'm like, let's just move on to how we can make this right and move on to the next exciting things. But yeah, people who sit in
Yeah.
those, and just even the smallest examples too, it reminds me of, I had some people in situations where they're like, well, I didn't get the project done because I emailed the person, but I never heard back. I'm like,
Mm.
okay. Now again, at this point, the people who reported to me more are not those thinkers, but I definitely had these for a period of time. And my answer back to that was like, okay, like I try to give them enough time and ask the question to be like, but did you call them? Like it shouldn't be that complex, but people sometimes look at it as I did mine. It's now on them. Like it's a hot potato. And it's like, that is
Yeah.
not going to get somebody where they want. And maybe this sounds crazy to some people listening. Like who would do that? A lot of people
Yeah.
do that. And it's why a
Yeah.
lot of people in organizations end up sitting in the same role for a very long period of time and never move into leadership, because it's a wrong comparison to make. No, maybe it's not wrong. It's just some people will take offense to it. But when I think about parenting and when I do think about leadership, there are
Yeah.
so many similarities in there, because you're trying to lead by example. You want to show what's right. While at the same time, there are certain behaviors that will come out of it that you then want to make sure that you're modeling what a team should do, just like you would for your own kiddos and family. But people have things that they've learned throughout their life and they can unlearn those things. But I think it's so important when it comes to the whole victor and victim thing is you don't want to be the person who's adding a lot of friction in the workplace. You don't want your boss to have to say the obvious thing of, did you call them? Well, no, because I sent them an email or whatever it is. Like you're stuck. And then the next question comes into, why are you saying this now on the day it's due? If this was a problem, you knew it was a problem X days ago. You want the person who's like, dude, if they have to share this, maybe they do, but they ghosted me on email 3 times. They wouldn't get back to me on Slack. They didn't answer my call 3 times, but I ended up taking them to lunch and getting the answers I needed. It's like, in the end, get it done. And even though somebody else might be like, why should you take them for lunch? They were making you do it. It's like, it doesn't matter. Own it, get it done. And I think that's a critical thing that, anybody who's having a lot of success in their life in general is because they don't let somebody else's no or lack of answer stand in their way. They're going to figure out how to get it done regardless, because they're committed to whatever the cause or the result is that they're trying to do.
Yeah. It reminds me of the radical responsibility, right? Do what needs to be done and move on.
That's it. Yeah. And you spend a lot less time in the end doing that than you would often in these moments of trying to figure out or point fingers or whatever it is. That's why at times I'm just like, whatever, here's what it is. Let's just move.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you so much for everything that you've shared on here. Where can everyone find you and connect with you?
Best bet is on LinkedIn. And
Yeah.
anybody also welcome to email me at michael@thevelocitylabs.com. My website is thevelocitylabs.com. I could drop these over to you so that you can potentially drop them below. But yeah, my LinkedIn handle here, as I make sure, is Mr. Michael Merrill. There was another Michael Merrill, so I had to be Mr. Michael Merrill. What are you going to do?
Perfect.
So that would be probably the best way. And I'm responsive to LinkedIn because, yeah, obviously, I believe others should leverage it too as much as they can.
Yeah, LinkedIn is where it's at now. Forget Instagram.
Right.
Pop over to LinkedIn.
Yeah. Just depends on what they're trying to accomplish. But yes, no, exactly it.
Yeah.
I'm there with you.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much again for being here.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.